May 1945. A pen scratches across a paper in a quiet prisoner of war camp in Bavaria. The hand holding that pen belongs to a German officer, a man whose country has just lost the most catastrophic war in human history. His uniform still carries the insignia of a regime that industrialized murder, and he is writing, in careful formal German, a complaint about the quality of his mattress. That single image, an officer of the Third Reich, safe, fed, and sheltered under American guard, composing a formal grievance about bed linens while the ashes of his war still smolder across a continent, is the door into everything that happened next. Because that complaint, and roughly 200 more like it, would eventually cross the desk of a man with no capacity left for that kind of arrogance. A man who had buried American boys in the sand of North Africa. A man who had pushed his Third Army through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. A man who only weeks earlier had walked into a liberated concentration camp and seen, with his own eyes, bodies stacked like cordwood and survivors too weak to stand. His name was General George S. Patton, and his answer to those complaints would become one of the strangest, quietest, and most morally devastating acts of the entire Second World War. Before we go further, if stories like this matter to you, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. These are the moments history books tend to skip, and we can only keep uncovering them with you watching. Now back to May 1945. 200 German officers, a convoy of American trucks, armed guards, and a destination that none of the prisoners were told. They climbed aboard expecting a transfer, perhaps a better camp, one more fitting to their rank. What they were actually driving toward was a place that would end their complaints for the rest of their lives. But to understand why Patton did what he did, you have to understand the world that made such a decision not only possible, but, in his mind, necessary. May the 1945. Germany is no longer a country, it is a crater. 12 years of the Third Reich have ended not in a heroic last stand, but in surrender papers signed at a small schoolhouse in Reims. Berlin is rubble, Dresden is rubble, Hamburg, Cologne, Nuremberg, rubble. 6 years of total war have killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million human beings. We're the single largest act of organized destruction in recorded history. Into this ruined landscape marches the American Army. 3 million soldiers suddenly responsible not just for winning a war, but for administering its wreckage. They have to feed refugees, house camp survivors, govern entire regions, and process roughly 1.5 million German prisoners of war under the rules of the Geneva Convention, the very convention Germany itself had signed and then spent 12 years violating. And here is where the story begins to sharpen into something uncomfortable. Because the German officer corps, the men who had commanded panzer divisions on the Eastern Front, administered occupation zones from Oslo to Athens, and carried the Iron Cross on their chests, did not arrive in captivity as broken men. They arrived as professionals. Well, they expected to be treated like professionals. They expected their rank to mean something. They expected, in short, to be respected. The camps in Bavaria were not cruel. Tents, barracks, 3 American military rations a day. The same food the GA guarding them was eating. Medical care. No forced labor, no torture. By any reasonable measure in the spring of 1945, the conditions were humane. That was the problem. Because for men who had just lost a war of extermination, humane was never going to be enough. Before we begin, please don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The Reich was gone, but something inside its officer class had not yet caught up to that fact. Across Bavaria, the American occupation machine was straining under a weight almost impossible to describe. Entire divisions had been reassigned from combat to caretaking. Field kitchens now fed the people they had been shooting at weeks earlier. Medics treated German wounds with the same morphine that had been rationed for American boys in the Ardennes. The Geneva Convention demanded it, and the American command honored it to the letter. The prisoners were housed in plain wooden barracks and canvas tents. They received 3 meals a day drawn from standard U.S. Army rations. They had clean water, functioning latrines, access to doctors, and male privileges. There was no forced labor beyond the upkeep of their own camps. There was no interrogation under duress. By any historical measure, it was one of the most humane mass captivities ever administered by a victorious army. And yet the letters began almost immediately. The bread was too coarse. The coffee was weak. Officers were being housed alongside enlisted men, a violation, they argued, of military tradition. One colonel requested a separate mess. Another demanded that his orderly be reassigned to him. A major wrote in flawless script that the absence of proper bedding was unbecoming of the dignity of a German officer. Dignity. The word appeared again and again. The stack of complaints on the American command's desk grew taller by the day, and eventually it landed in front of George S. Patton. By the spring of 1945, George S. Patton was not the same man who had landed in North Africa 3 years earlier. He had fought across Tunisia, stormed Sicily, raced his Third Army through France, and broken the German line at Bastogne in weather so cold that men froze to death inside their own foxholes. He had written letters to the mothers of boys whose names he would never forget. He had stood beside fresh graves in 6 countries. And then on April 12, 1945, he walked into Ohrdruf. Ohrdruf was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by the American Army, and what Patton found there broke something in him that combat never had. Bodies stacked in open pits, survivors so starved they no longer resembled the living, a shed full of corpses killed hours before the Americans arrived. Eisenhower stood beside him that day. So did Omar Bradley. All 3 generals, hardened men, walked the grounds in near silence. Patton reportedly stepped behind a barracks and was physically sick. Days later, he ordered every available American soldier to tour the camp. Then he ordered the mayor of the nearby town to bring its citizens through as well. The mayor and his wife went home and hanged themselves. Now, weeks later, at a desk far from those pits, Patton read through the officers' complaints. He read everyone. His face showed nothing. Then he stood, walked to a wall map of Bavaria, and placed a finger on a small town northwest of Munich. "Prepare transport," he said, "for 200 officers." The news spread quickly through the Bavarian camp. A transfer had been ordered. 200 officers would be moved by truck the following morning. No reason was given, and none of the Germans thought to ask for one. Among the officers, the mood shifted almost overnight. A transfer, in their reading of things, meant their complaints had been taken seriously. Perhaps they were being separated from the enlisted ranks at last. Perhaps a proper officers' facility had been arranged. And one colonel remarked that the Americans, for all their bluntness, still understood military order. Another straightened his tunic before breakfast. A few even packed their belongings carefully, as men do when they expect to be seen. The convoy left at dawn. American trucks, canvas-covered, armed guards at the tailgates. The Bavarian countryside rolled past in early spring green. Villages untouched by bombing. Farmers already back in their fields. Church spires catching the morning sun. Inside the trucks, conversation was surprisingly light. Some of the officers speculated about their destination. Salzburg, perhaps. A repurposed spa hotel. Somewhere befitting their rank. They noticed after a while that the convoy was moving northwest, toward Munich. Still, no one said very much. Then the truck slowed. The officers leaned forward to see through the canvas openings. A long perimeter of fencing came into view. Guard towers, a low gatehouse, and above the entrance, worked in black iron against the pale sky, 3 words they all recognized instantly. Arbeit macht frei. The trucks rolled to a stop. The tailgates dropped. No one spoke. No one moved. The officers were marched through the gate in silence. American guards walked at a measured pace behind them, rifles held low, faces unreadable. The first thing that struck them was the smell. Even weeks after liberation, it had not left the ground. An American officer led the tour. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He simply walked them through building by building and stated facts. The barracks came first. Our structures designed for 200 men had held more than 2,000. Wooden bunks were stacked 4 high, their slats bare, no mattresses, no blankets. Only scraps of straw pressed into the wood by the weight of bodies that no longer existed. One officer lifted a hand to cover his nose. Another stepped back into the aisle, then stopped, unsure where to go. They were shown the latrines, the sick wards, where typhus had spread faster than the SES could shoot the infected. The kitchens where rations had been calculated to cause slow death by mathematics rather than bullet. Then the punishment cells, narrow concrete boxes where a man could neither sit nor stand. Hooks bolted into beams where prisoners had been hung by their wrists, twisted behind their backs until their shoulders tore loose from the joint. And finally, the crematorium. The iron doors still open, the floor still stained. The American officer read aloud from a single sheet of paper. Numbers, dates, the estimated dead. Over 40,000 at this camp alone. One of the Germans began to weep. Another dropped to a crouch against a wall. And then, from the far end of the yard, a door opened. The survivors were coming. They came out slowly. A dozen men, then more behind them. Some walked unaided. Others leaned on the shoulders of those beside them. Their striped uniforms had been replaced with clean clothing, but the clothing still hung loose on frames that had not yet learned how to carry flesh again. Their heads were shaved. Their eyes, unlike anything the officers had ever seen, did not look away. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. And the survivors simply walked into the yard and stopped a short distance from the Germans. Then one of them raised his arm and pointed. He named an officer standing near the front. He gave the date. He gave the place. He described a transport he had been loaded onto in Poland and the name of the man who had signed the order. The officer he was pointing at had signed it. Another survivor stepped forward. He did not point. He simply walked up to a specific German major, stopped in front of him, and said the name of his wife, then the name of his son, then the ages they had been. The major's knees gave out. He went down onto the gravel and did not get up. One by one, the survivors spoke, not in anger, in memory, specific trains, specific barracks, specific hours of specific days, but if following orders, the phrase that had already begun echoing through the halls in Nuremberg, died in that courtyard. It did not survive contact with a living face. When it was finished, Patton stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. "You are alive," he said. "You are fed. You are standing. Remember who is not." No one complained again. The convoy that returned to the Bavarian camp that evening was not the same one that had left that morning. The trucks were quieter than any prisoner transport the American guards had ever escorted. No conversation, no movement. When the tailgates dropped, the officers stepped down in silence and walked to their barracks without being told. By morning, the complaints had stopped, every last one. But in American command posts further up the chain, a different kind of trouble was beginning. The word of the Dachau visit traveled fast. Within days, questions were being raised, not by the Germans, but by Americans. Senior officers, judge advocates, and staff attorneys began asking whether what Patton had done fit within the rules of the Geneva Convention, the very framework the United States had been scrupulously enforcing in every other aspect of prisoner handling. The argument against him was straightforward. Prisoners of war were to be protected from humiliation, from intimidation, from acts calculated to produce psychological distress. Marching captured officers through a death camp, the critics argued, was exactly such an act. It looked on paper like coercion dressed in moral clothing. A military lawyer rose in Patton's defense. His argument was simpler still. Patton had not interrogated the officers. He had not extracted confessions. He had not struck them, starved them, or denied them sleep. He had shown them a place that existed. Reality, the lawyer argued, was not a weapon. The challenge was quietly dropped. No formal charge was ever filed. But the question did not go away, and it would resurface on a far larger stage within months. In the weeks that followed, the Bavarian camp changed in ways that could not be written into any official report. No more complaints were filed. Not about food, not about bedding, not about rank. The formal German for "I protest," a phrase the American clerks had come to know by heart, disappeared from the paperwork entirely. When guards entered the barracks, the officers stood without being asked. When tasks were assigned, they were completed without objection. The air in the camp, one American captain later wrote, had gone from brittle to heavy. There were conversations now that had not existed before. Officers began asking their guards carefully what was known about the trials being organized in Nuremberg. They asked which units were being investigated. They asked about specific names. A few asked whether their own names had been mentioned. Some requested paper and wrote long letters, not of complaint, but of account. Where they had served, what orders they had passed along, what they had seen, and what they had chosen not to see. It was not repentance exactly. It was something quieter and in some ways harder. It was the slow, unwelcome recognition that the distance they had placed between themselves and the machinery of the Reich was a distance they had invented. What Patton had done at Dachau, in a single afternoon, would soon be done on a global scale in a courtroom in Nuremberg. The principle was the same. Do not argue with them, show them, and let the evidence do what words never could. The months that followed carried the world into a new kind of courtroom. In Nuremberg, the surviving leadership of the Third Reich sat behind a long wooden rail, while films of the camps played on a screen in front of them. Prosecutors did not raise their voices. They did not argue. They showed. The same method Patton had used with 200 officers in a single afternoon was now being used, frame by frame, against the architects of the war itself. The Bavarian camp emptied gradually. Some of the officers were transferred to denazification hearings. Some were investigated for specific crimes. Others, against whom no evidence was ever found, were eventually released and sent home to villages that no longer looked like the ones they had left. One of them left something behind. A clerk cleaning out the barracks after a group of prisoners had been processed out found a folded sheet of paper tucked inside an empty drawer. It was written in neat German script. At the top, no heading, no date, no signature, only a list of names, 12 of them. Beside each name, a single word or phrase, a town, a date, a profession, a child's age, nothing more. No explanation was ever attached. No letter of confession accompanied it. The officer who wrote it never came forward, and no record was made of whose hand had held the pen. It was not a document meant for the Americans. It was not a document meant for history. It was, as far as anyone could tell, a document meant only for the man who wrote it, a private ledger of 12 people he could have helped and did not. That small piece of paper, in its way, carries the whole meaning of what Patton did that day in Dachau. He did not punish those officers. He did not lecture them. He placed them inside the truth of their own war and let the truth do the work. Some walked away unchanged. Some walked away broken. And at least one walked away carrying a list he would keep for the rest of his life. The principle outlived all of them. It shaped the Nuremberg judgments. It shaped the Geneva Conventions that followed. It still shapes the way international courts, truth commissions, and war crimes tribunals operate today. Confrontation, not cruelty. Evidence, not argument. Recognition, not revenge. Because once a man has seen the truth of what he has done, Silence becomes the only language left.